August 15th, 1940. 3:47 p.m. RAF Ventnor, Isle of Wight. The cathode ray tube glowed green in the darkness. WAF Corporal Elizabeth Henderson leaned closer, her eyes fixed on the phosphorescent screen as a faint blip appeared at the edge of the display. 40 miles south, moving north at 200 miles per hour. Her fingers moved across the plotting table with practiced precision, marking the bearing and range with a grease pencil. Around her, the underground operations room hummed with controlled urgency. The whisper of headset cables, the scratch of pencils on paper, the low murmur of coordinates being relayed through telephone lines to fighter command. Hostile formation bearing 180, range 40 miles, Angels 15. She called out, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. The blip wasn't alone. As she watched, more appeared, a constellation of green dots materializing on her screen like stars emerging at dusk. 15 aircraft, 20, 30. The Luftwaffe was coming, and she was the first person in Britain to know it. 6 months earlier, Elizabeth Henderson had been a shop assistant in Portsmouth. She'd never seen the inside of a radar station, never heard of radio direction finding. The official name for this miraculous technology that could see aircraft through clouds, through darkness, through the very curve of the earth itself. She certainly never imagined she'd be one of the invisible sentinels standing between Britain and Nazi invasion. But in the summer of 1940, with the Battle of Britain raging in the skies and every able-bodied man needed in a cockpit or on a ship, the Royal Air Force had made a radical decision to train women to operate the most sensitive, most critical technology in Britain's defensive arsenal. They called it an experiment. The men in the Air Ministry called it desperate. Some called it foolish. The women themselves didn't call it anything. They simply reported for duty. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force had existed since 1918, disbanded after the Great War, then hastily reformed in 1939 when it became clear that Hitler's ambitions wouldn't stop at Poland. Initially, the WAFs were assigned traditional roles: clerks, drivers, cooks, telephone operators, safe jobs, women's jobs. But radar was different. Radar required sharp eyes, sharper minds, and nerves of steel. It required operators who could distinguish a formation of German bombers from a flock of geese, who could calculate intercept vectors in their heads while bombs fell overhead, who could stay at their posts when every instinct screamed to run for shelter. The first WAF radar operators arrived at their stations in late 1939, wide-eyed and uncertain, facing equipment that looked like something from a science fiction magazine. The Chain Home Radar System, Britain's early warning network, consisted of towering steel lattice masts 350 feet tall, studded with antenna arrays that looked like geometric artwork. Inside the concrete operations blocks, the equipment was equally intimidating. Massive transmitters that crackled with electricity, receivers sensitive enough to detect the echo of radio waves bouncing off metal objects 100 miles away, and those eerie cathode ray tubes that displayed the results as glowing blips on a dark screen. They told us we'd be replacing the men, recalled WAF Avis Parsons years later, describing her first day at RAF Bawdsey in Suffolk. What they didn't tell us was that the men didn't want to be replaced. Some of them thought we'd panic at the first sign of action. Others thought we simply weren't intelligent enough to understand the equipment. We had to prove them wrong, one shift at a time. The training was intensive. The women learned radio theory, aircraft recognition, plotting procedures, and mathematics. Endless mathematics. They memorized the radar signatures of every aircraft in the RAF inventory and as many Luftwaffe types as intelligence could provide. They practiced tracking mock raids until their eyes ached and their hands cramped. And they learned to operate in the dark because radar stations were blacked out. Windowless bunkers where the only light came from the instruments themselves. By the spring of 1940, WAF operators were working alongside their RAF counterparts at every chain home station along Britain's coast. By summer, they outnumbered the men. By August, when Elizabeth Henderson spotted that formation of German aircraft approaching the Isle of Wight, women were running entire shifts without male supervision. The Luftwaffe didn't know this, of course. German intelligence had identified Britain's radar towers as priority targets. Those distinctive masts were impossible to hide. But they assumed the stations were manned by RAF technicians and officers. The idea that young women in their 20s, some barely out of school, were the ones actually operating this vital defensive system would have seemed absurd to the German High Command. They underestimated British desperation. More importantly, they underestimated British women. Raid now 35 miles, bearing 175, estimated strength 40-plus aircraft, multiple formations. Henderson's voice carried across the operations room to the telephone exchange, where another WAF operator immediately relayed the information to RAF Uxbridge. To Fighter Command Headquarters, where Air Vice Marshal Keith Park would scramble Spitfires and Hurricanes to intercept. The information had to be perfect. Too early, and the fighters would run out of fuel before making contact. Too late, and the bombers would reach their targets unopposed. The margin for error was measured in minutes. Henderson adjusted the range dial, narrowing the focus. The raid was definitely hostile. The formation structure, the altitude, the direction all matched Luftwaffe patterns. She could see now that it wasn't a single wave, but 3 separate groups, probably targeting Portsmouth, Southampton, and perhaps Ventnor itself. The Germans had learned that destroying radar stations could blind Fighter Command, and they'd been systematically attacking chain home installations all week. "They're splitting up," she called out. "Main body continuing north, second formation bearing away east, third formation bearing west, possibly targeting the station." The room went quiet for a heartbeat. Then training took over. The plotting continued, the reports flowed, and somewhere above them, air raid sirens began their rising wail. The operators didn't flinch. They had a job to do, and bombs falling on their own heads didn't change that job. If anything, it made it more important. This was what the Air Ministry experiment had discovered. Women didn't panic under pressure. They didn't grandstand or take unnecessary risks. They simply did the work with a calm efficiency that impressed even the most skeptical officers. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of RAF Fighter Command, had initially opposed using women in combat-adjacent roles. By mid-1940, he was calling them indispensable. Even Winston Churchill took notice. The Prime Minister had visited several radar stations during the summer, watching the waifs at work with his characteristic intense curiosity. At Bawdsey, he'd spent an hour observing the operators track incoming raids, asking technical questions, testing their knowledge. He'd left without saying much. Churchill rarely offered immediate praise. But weeks later, in a secret session of Parliament, he mentioned the women manning the radar network as proof that Britain's defensive preparations were thorough and modern. It wasn't the recognition they deserved, but it was something. For now, though, recognition was secondary to survival. On Henderson's screen, the raid continued its advance, 28 miles now. 25. Fighter Command had been alerted. Squadrons were scrambling from Tangmere and Middle Wallop. But interception wasn't guaranteed. The Germans might break through, might drop their bombs on the ports and factories and cities below. Might drop them on this very station. 20 miles. Elizabeth Henderson marked the position, called out the bearing, and prepared for the next update. Around her, 8 other WAF operators worked their own screens and plotting tables, tracking different sectors of the sky. Outside, the radar masts continued their invisible watch, pulsing radio energy into the summer sky, waiting for echoes to return. And high above the English Channel, young men in Spitfires were already turning their fighters toward the intercept point, guided by information provided by women whose names they'd never know. The Battle of Britain would become legend. The few who saved the nation in its darkest hour. But those few couldn't have fought without eyes to guide them. They couldn't have won without the invisible army of women who watched the skies from underground bunkers, who turned radio echoes into tactical intelligence, who stayed at their posts when bombs fell and kept Britain from fighting blind. This is their story. The bombs hit RAF Ventnor at 4:12 p.m. Elizabeth Henderson felt the first explosion through the concrete floor. A deep, visceral thud that rattled the plotting table and sent pencils rolling across its surface. The overhead lights flickered. Dust drifted down from the ceiling joints. On her cathode ray screen, the blips continued their relentless advance, now barely 15 miles away. She didn't look up. Her hands moved automatically, marking the new position, calling out coordinates to the telephone exchange, even as a second explosion shook the building harder than the first. Raid now 14 miles, bearing 178, maintain Angels 15. She reported, her voice cutting through the sudden tension in the room. Around her, the other operators held their positions. No one ran for the shelters. No one screamed. The training had prepared them for this moment. But training could only do so much. The rest was simply courage. The kind that doesn't announce itself with speeches or medals, but manifests as pencil marks on paper. While the world shakes apart overhead, a third bomb struck somewhere close. Close enough that the lights went out completely. Emergency power kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing the operations room in dim red illumination that made the radar screens easier to read, but turned everything else into shadow. Henderson could hear the muffled crump of additional explosions, could smell the acrid scent of cordite filtering through the ventilation system. The Luftwaffe had found its target. All stations, this is Ventnor. We are under direct attack, maintaining operations. The voice belonged to Flight Officer Margaret Campbell, the senior WF on duty, speaking with the same calm authority she used during training exercises. Continue normal procedures until instructed otherwise. Normal procedures. As if there was anything normal about tracking enemy bombers while those same bombers dropped high explosives on your position. But the order made sense. Panic was contagious, and someone had to model composure. If Campbell could stay calm, so could her operators. If Henderson could keep plotting, so could the woman beside her. One steady voice anchored another and another, until the entire room held together through sheer collective will. The raid Henderson was tracking had reached the coast now, the lead formation passing directly overhead. On her screen, she watched the blips converge with the approximate position of Ventnor itself. Watched, in other words, as the abstract became horrifyingly concrete. Then the formation continued north, toward Portsmouth and the naval dockyards. They'd struck Ventnor on the way, a target of opportunity, but their primary objective lay inland. Henderson tracked them for another 6 minutes, until they passed out of her sector and into coverage from RAF Poling further east. Raid leaving my sector bearing 355, distance 22 miles, she reported. Then, only then, did she allow herself to take a full breath. The all-clear sounded at 4:47 p.m. When the operators finally emerged from the operations block, they found RAF Ventnor transformed into a landscape of craters and twisted metal. 2 of the 4 radar towers had been destroyed, their steel lattices collapsed into geometric wreckage. The transmitter building was a smoking ruin. 3 men from the maintenance crew were dead, killed while trying to reach the shelters. But the operations block itself, buried partially underground and reinforced with concrete, had survived intact. The women had survived intact. And crucially, they had maintained tracking data throughout the attack, providing fighter command with uninterrupted intelligence that had allowed successful interception of the main raid over Portsmouth. Air Vice Marshal Park sent a personal commendation the next day. The operators at Ventnor performed their duties with exemplary courage and professionalism under the most trying circumstances. Their actions directly contributed to the successful defense of Portsmouth and serve as a model for all stations in the network. It was the first official recognition that WAF operators weren't merely assistants or substitutes, but fully capable defenders of Britain in their own right. It wouldn't be the last test. Between August and October 1940, the Luftwaffe struck British radar stations repeatedly, understanding that blind defenders were defenseless defenders. The attacks were coordinated, often using low-level raids to evade detection, sometimes employing specialized equipment to jam radar signals. The chain-home network was resilient. Its multiple overlapping stations meant that destroying one rarely created a true blind spot. But every attack tested the resolve of the men and women, keeping it operational. At RAF Poling in Sussex, WAF operators continued tracking raids even after a direct hit knocked out their primary transmitter and started fires in the adjacent buildings. At RAF Pevensey, they maintained operations through a sustained bombing that left the station so cratered it resembled photographs of the Western Front. At RAF Rye, WAF Corporal Joan Strother stayed at her post during an attack that killed her supervisor and wounded 2 other operators, calmly completing the track of an incoming raid before allowing herself to be evacuated for treatment of shrapnel wounds. The casualties were real. By the end of the Battle of Britain, 14 WAFs had been killed in action at radar stations, with dozens more wounded. They received no combat pay, no hazard allowance, no formal recognition as frontline troops. The Official Secrets Act meant their families often didn't know the true nature of their work. Death notices spoke vaguely of duties in support of air defense, without mentioning radar or operations rooms, or the fact that their daughters had died doing work the military establishment had insisted only men could handle. But within fighter command, attitudes shifted rapidly. Doubting skepticism evaporated as his operations officers reported again and again on the performance of WAF radar operators under fire. By September 1940, he was actively requesting more women for the radar network, arguing that they demonstrated better attention to detail and sustained concentration than many of their male counterparts. This wasn't sentiment or propaganda. It was pragmatic recognition that Britain's survival depended on using every capable person, regardless of gender. The efficiency statistics supported this assessment. WAF operators had lower error rates in aircraft identification, faster reaction times in calling out tracks, and better adherence to standardized reporting procedures. Some of this reflected superior training. The women knew they were under scrutiny and compensated with meticulous preparation. Some reflected the selection process. Volunteers for radar duty underwent rigorous aptitude testing that screened for visual acuity, mathematical ability, and stress tolerance. But some of it, veteran operators later suggested, simply reflected a different approach to the work. Where male operators sometimes tried to interpret data or second-guess their readings, women tended to report exactly what they saw, trusting the filter officers and controllers to make tactical decisions. That literal mindedness, often dismissed as feminine lack of initiative, proved perfectly suited to a job where accurate information mattered more than bold interpretation. Wing Commander Edward Fennessy, who oversaw radar operations for 11 Group, put it bluntly in a 1941 memo. The WAF operators are not merely adequate replacements for RAF personnel. In many cases, they are superior. I would rather have an experienced WAF on the scopes than an inexperienced airman, and I have several WAFs I would not trade for anyone. This professional respect translated into operational trust. By late 1940, women were not only operating radar equipment, but training new operators, supervising entire shifts, and contributing to tactical planning. At RAF Bawdsey, WAF Flight Officer Eileen Young-Husband became the de facto authority on radar calibration, developing improved procedures for distinguishing genuine aircraft returns from atmospheric interference. Work that required deep technical understanding and innovative thinking. At Fighter Command Headquarters, WAF officers worked in the filter room, synthesizing raw radar data from multiple stations into coherent operational pictures that guided defensive responses. Churchill visited the filter room at RAF Uxbridge in September 1940. During the height of the battle, he stood on the observation gallery, watching WAFs push wooden blocks across the giant map table below, each block representing a raid tracked by the radar network. The blocks moved with mechanical precision, updated every few minutes as fresh data flowed in from the chain home stations. Churchill watched for 20 minutes, smoking his cigar, saying nothing. Then he turned to Park, who was standing beside him. "How long can they keep this up?" Churchill asked. "As long as necessary, Prime Minister," Park replied. "They haven't failed us yet?" Churchill grunted acknowledgement, his eyes still on the women below. Years later, in his war memoirs, he would write that the Battle of Britain was won by the few, the fighter pilots who flew and fought and died in the summer sky. He mentioned radar in passing, acknowledging its importance. But he never specifically credited the women who operated it, who turned invisible radio echoes into the tactical intelligence that made victory possible. That recognition would take decades. October 31st, 1940. The battle was over. Not officially. The Luftwaffe would continue sporadic daylight raids for months, and the blitz against British cities was just intensifying. But the sustained campaign to achieve air superiority over southern England had failed. Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion threat receded. Britain had survived, and the RAF's fighter squadrons received the laurels of victory. Newspapers celebrated the pilots, Churchill immortalized them in Parliament, and the legend of the few was born before the smoke had even cleared. In the operations room at RAF Ventnor, Elizabeth Henderson marked the end of her shift at 800 hours on November 1st. She removed her headset, logged her final entries in the tracking book, and walked out into pale autumn sunlight. The 2 destroyed radar towers still lay in twisted ruin at the edge of the station. There hadn't been time or resources to clear them away. But temporary masts had been erected, the transmitters had been repaired, and the station was operating at nearly full capacity again. The work continued, as it always had, as it always would, with or without recognition. Henderson didn't expect recognition. None of them did. The Official Secrets Act meant they couldn't discuss their work with family or friends. Most civilians had no idea what happened inside those concrete bunkers beneath the radar towers. Even other military personnel often didn't understand. Henderson's own sister, serving as an Army nurse, thought Elizabeth worked as a clerk or telephone operator, something safe and administrative. The truth was classified, would remain classified for years, and by the time it was finally revealed, the world would have moved on to newer wars and newer technologies. But the women remembered. Through 1941 and 1942, as the war ground on, WAF radar operators remained at their posts. The nature of the threat changed. Fewer massive daylight raids, more nighttime bomber streams, eventually the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets that no amount of early warning could effectively counter. The chain home network expanded, incorporating new stations, new technologies, new capabilities. And at every station, WAFs comprised the majority of operators. Their competence no longer questioned, their presence no longer controversial. By 1943, over 15,000 women served in radar-related roles across the RAF. From operators to mechanics to technical specialists. They tracked German aircraft over the North Sea, guided night fighters to their targets, and provided surveillance data for RAF bombing missions over occupied Europe. Some, like WAF Flight Officer Constance Babington Smith, became experts in photographic reconnaissance interpretation. Another technical specialty initially reserved for men, another barrier quietly broken through demonstrated competence. The work remained dangerous. WAF Helen Turner died at RAF Beachy Head in 1943 when a German fighter strafed the station during a low-level attack. WAF Patricia Clark was killed at RAF Sandwich when a V-1 flying bomb struck the operations block. Dozens more were wounded in raids throughout the war. They received small notices in service publications, sometimes a brief mention in local newspapers, but never the public attention afforded to combat deaths in more visible branches of service. After the war ended, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force was disbanded. The chain home stations shut down, their technology obsolete in the jet age. The operators returned to civilian life, to families and careers, and the assumption that their wartime service had been clerical, supportive, auxiliary. The word itself suggested secondary importance. Few people asked what they'd actually done, and the Official Secrets Act discouraged those who might have wanted to talk. Elizabeth Henderson went back to Portsmouth, married an RAF flight mechanic she'd met during the war, and worked as a school teacher for 30 years. She never told her students she'd been a radar operator. When the Official Secrets Act was partially lifted in the 1960s, and she was technically allowed to discuss her service, she found that nobody was particularly interested. The Battle of Britain had been mythologized, its narrative solidified. Brave pilots in Spitfires defending Britain against the Luftwaffe hordes. There was no room in that story for women in underground bunkers staring at cathode ray tubes. The recognition, when it finally came, was piecemeal and incomplete. In 1974, the RAF Museum at Hendon opened an exhibit on the Battle of Britain that included a reconstructed radar station and mentioned, briefly, the contribution of WAF operators. In 1990, the 50th anniversary of the battle prompted renewed historical interest, and several books included chapters on the chain home network and the women who operated it. In 2010, a memorial was unveiled at the former site of RAF Bawdsey, bearing the names of WAFs who served there. But the comprehensive recognition, the integration of these women into the standard narrative of Britain's defense, remained elusive. Popular history still focused overwhelmingly on the fighter pilots. Films and documentaries devoted hours to aerial combat and minutes, if that, to the ground-based systems that made that combat possible. The few remained few, their legend untarnished by the inconvenient truth that they depended absolutely on the many who watched and plotted and guided them from below. Elizabeth Henderson lived to see some of this recognition. She attended the Bawdsey Memorial unveiling in 2010, one of a handful of surviving radar operators, and gave a brief interview to a local television station. She was 92 years old, her memory sharp, her opinions characteristically understated. "We did our jobs," she said when asked about her wartime service. "Same as the pilots did theirs, same as everyone did theirs. I don't think we expected special credit for it. The country needed defending, and we had skills that could help defend it, so we did. That was all." The interviewer pressed her. Didn't she feel overlooked, given how crucial radar had been to the RAF's success? Henderson considered the question for a long moment. "I suppose we were overlooked," she admitted. "But honestly, at the time, we were too busy to notice. And after the war, we had lives to rebuild. Maybe that's the real story. Not that we weren't recognized, but that we didn't need recognition to do the work. We knew what we'd done. The people we worked with knew. That was enough." It was a gracious answer, the kind of modest deflection that characterized that generation's approach to service and sacrifice. But it didn't tell the complete truth, because Henderson's private papers, donated to the Imperial War Museum after her death in 2015, told a more complex story. There were letters to the Air Ministry in the 1950s, inquiring about service medals for radar operators. There were newspaper clippings saved for decades, articles about the Battle of Britain that never mentioned the chain home network. There was a draft manuscript, never completed, titled "We Also Served," attempting to document the experiences of WAF radar operators before their memories faded entirely. She had cared about recognition. She had wanted her service acknowledged, wanted the public to understand that Britain's victory had required more than fighter pilots and courage in the sky. She'd spent years trying, quietly, to ensure the story was told. And like so many women of her generation, she'd done so without bitterness, without demanding credit, simply hoping that someday, somehow, the record would be corrected. That correction is still incomplete. Modern historians recognize the vital role of radar in the Battle of Britain, and most scholarly accounts acknowledge the predominance of WAF operators in the system. But popular understanding lags behind scholarship, as it always does. The public imagination still sees the Battle of Britain through the lens of aerial combat. Spitfires and Hurricanes wheeling in summer skies, contrails marking the geometry of combat. Brave young men facing death at 20,000 feet. Which was real and true and worthy of remembrance, but incomplete. The complete story requires understanding that those pilots flew blind without the women who watched the skies from underground rooms, who turned radio echoes into actionable intelligence, who stayed at their posts when bombs fell and buildings collapsed. It requires acknowledging that Britain's defensive victory in 1940 was won not just by individual heroism, but by systematic competence. The unglamorous work of tracking and plotting and reporting, done hour after hour, shift after shift, by people whose names never appeared in newspapers. Elizabeth Henderson's cathode ray screen, which saw the Luftwaffe coming on August 15, 1940, is preserved now at the RAF Museum in Hendon. It sits in a glass case, alongside other artifacts from the Battle of Britain. A Spitfire propeller, a pilot's logbook, fragments of German aircraft shot down over Kent. The placard beneath it reads, "Radar display, Type 1, chain home network. Operated primarily by Women's Auxiliary Air Force personnel during the Battle of Britain." Primarily. Even now, the language hedges, qualifies, avoid stating plainly that by August 1940, nearly every radar operator watching Britain's skies was a woman. That these women performed under fire with the same courage demanded of any combat soldier. That their contribution was not auxiliary, but essential. Perhaps that final recognition will come eventually, when the last survivors have passed and historians can write without worrying about offending the sensibilities of the generation that lived it. Perhaps popular culture will someday find room for stories about women who saved Britain without firing a shot, who fought with mathematics and cathode ray tubes instead of guns, whose battlefield was measured in megahertz and range gates rather than territory. Or perhaps the recognition doesn't matter as much as the fact itself. They did it. When Britain needed defenders, they defended. When the military said women couldn't handle technical work under combat conditions, they proved otherwise. When bombs fell and buildings burned, they stayed at their posts and did their jobs with a calm professionalism that impressed even Churchill. They were the eyes that saw the enemy coming. They were the invisible sentinels who kept Britain from fighting blind. And for a few crucial months in 1940, when the nation's survival balanced on the edge of a knife, they were the difference between victory and defeat. Even Churchill was impressed. Hope